Thank you for joining us on this Holocaust Memorial Day to listen and learn from Dame Stephanie Shirley's life experiences. During the first part of the program, please remember to keep your microphones muted. And in the second part of the program, you will have the opportunity to ask questions by using the raise hand function and speaking when called upon, or by typing your question into the chat. As we begin our program, I want to invite us to remember that the horrific events of the Holocaust did not occur in some bizarre moral or religious vacuum, but in many senses, they were a manifestation and culmination of toxic Christian theologies that had been developed over centuries of racial and religious hostility towards Jewish people. As a Christian who believes that following Jesus means giving your life for others, I was horrified when I learned that Christians who resisted Nazis and protected Jewish people during World War II were a minority amongst German Christians, and that many Nazi leaders embraced what they called positive Christianity. I continue to be horrified today when I see images of neo-Nazis publicly marching in Europe and the US, when I hear that terrorists are targeting synagogues and Jewish buildings are being defaced by swastikas, and when many responses from Christian communities is silence at best and collaboration at worst. It is imperative that Christians and other people of faith relentlessly examine the implications of our beliefs and practices. And when we discover that a belief is leading to someone's harm, especially to their death, we must draw upon all the strength, love, and wisdom our faith tradition blesses us with, and work to address those harmful beliefs and practices in various creative and restorative ways. Participating in an interfaith forum like this, where we have opportunities to listen and learn from many others and to ask questions, is a wonderful way to develop our capacities in this essential work. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would now like to introduce the Right Reverend Martin Gorick, Bishop of Dudley, to give us a welcome address.
Thank you, Anastasia, and for those powerful words of introduction. And thank you to Thea and all at Oxford Interfaith Forum for your kind invitation to say a few words of introduction this evening. It's a great privilege of which I am in no way worthy. Nothing I can say can begin to reflect adequately on the horror and undeserved suffering that took place in the Shoah or calamity. What words can I say when faced with the horror of the Holocaust? Today is Holocaust Memorial Day. 20 years ago, the government invited British people to observe 27th of January as Holocaust Memorial Day. It's the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz on this day in 1945. The idea of a national Holocaust commemoration was proposed, I understand, with three aims in mind. Firstly, to commemorate the murder by the Nazis and their agents of 6 million Jewish people, along with millions more gypsies, dissenters, people with disabilities, gay people, Jehovah's Witnesses, and many others belonging to various minority groups. Secondly, to acknowledge the repeated occurrences of genocide around the world since 1945, such as in Bosnia or Rwanda. And thirdly, in this country anyway, to renew the commitment of British people to combat racism, religious hatred, and xenophobia, and to work for an inclusive, caring, and open society. 20 years on, the need for this act of remembrance seems greater than ever. Every one of the 6 million Jewish people murdered was a real person with parents and friends and family. Tonight, I light a candle to remember just one. It's always hard to light a candle to order. There we go. This candle is lit to remember a little girl, Johanna Brassen, who perished in her home city of Amsterdam on 4th of June, 1940. Aged just 2 years old. If she'd lived, she would be in her 80s now. Remember her name and honor her memory, amongst so many others. The figure of Job in the Hebrew Bible is someone struck by appalling life events, as his sons and daughters, servants and livestock, and even his own health are stripped from him. Finally, he sits covered with sores, alone in the dust. His friends come to see him. They don't get a good press amongst preachers, as they try and fail to account for his loss in rational words. But I'm always impressed by how they appear when they first meet Job, covered with sores, sitting amongst ashes. They weep and tear their clothes. Then they sit down beside him in the dust. And they say nothing at all for 7 days and 7 nights. No one spoke a word to him, it says, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Which of us would be capable of giving that kind of focused, silent attention and love to a suffering friend? We keep silent in our hearts tonight and listen, particularly to our main speaker. And sometimes we can only be brought to silence by the sheer horror of the Shoah or Holocaust. But then Job, out of his own pain and loss, began to speak. And tonight we will hear of these terrible times from a witness. And what a privilege that will be. In the face of such suffering, we need first to be silent and to listen to the voice who know better than we, and listen too to the inner call of God on our own lives. 6 million Jewish children, women, and men were killed in the Holocaust. They had their lives cut short in ways both brutal and systematic. It was not just an act of hatred, but an organized attempt to destroy a whole civilization. It was a crime that involved countless ordinary people like me, who simply followed orders or went along with things out of ignorance or often out of fear. It's often been said that when good people do nothing, evil can triumph. As Anastasia said, some courageous Christian people stood actively against Hitler and were put to death themselves for doing so. Many others looked the other way, perhaps disgusted by what they saw, perhaps agreeing with what they saw, but most perhaps paralyzed by fear into doing nothing. In the words of the late Jonathan Sacks, the Holocaust shows where evil ends if you first allow it to begin. And the number 6 million, so familiar, but the reality mind-blowing. Look at the faces on the Zoom screen tonight. Then imagine that screen changing every 1 second to show another 20 people, and then another 20 faces, every second, every second, every second. That would that would have to go on every second, every hour, for 3 days and 3 nights without stopping, to show the faces of 6 million people. Or on 11th of September 2001, 3,000 people tragically lost their lives in the Twin Towers, the most deadly terrorist attack America has ever known. In the Holocaust, an average of 3,000 Jews lost their lives every day for 5 whole years. Tonight we remember little Johanna Brassem from Amsterdam and all the 6 million Jewish people and all the others murdered in those terrible times. We give thanks too for all who survived, who went on to live, and many to raise families. Those generations across the world, proving that Hitler and his supporters ultimately failed. That in the end, hatred, evil, and death did not have the last word. For in the end, I believe that love is stronger than hate, good is greater than evil, and life is stronger than death. Tonight we affirm that every human life is infinitely precious. And as Johanna's candle gives of itself to bring light to others, we commit ourselves afresh to do the same. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for that really powerful introduction to this evening's event. I feel incredibly honoured to be here this evening and to have the opportunity to introduce this particular speaker. She is someone who is a source of inspiration, admiration, and no small degree of practical advice for me in my role as director of the Oxford Internet Institute, of which she was the founding donor. You're going to hear much more about Dame Stephanie's early life over the next hour, but I suspect you'll be far too modest to refer to the many and significant successes which follow the haunting account of her arrival in England. Over the decades since, she's played so many roles, choosing to make the best of her life and, where possible, to always make a difference. She's done so as a computer programmer, an entrepreneur, a businesswoman, I might note with a man's name, as a wife, a mother, philanthropist, and rather fantastically now, as a dame. In so many of those roles, she has forged her own unique path, choosing to first establish a software company, Xansa, at a time when software was routinely sold rather insignificantly along with the hardware, in choosing to employ a predominantly female workforce in an era where women had once again been relegated to the home, and then more recently, choosing to give away her wealth to the extent that in fact she was designated the UK's ambassador for philanthropy at a moment when so many others, it seems, go to extraordinary lengths to hide and retain their millions. Today, of all days, when we remember the millions that have suffered the worst of what humans are capable of, I think it is rather wonderful to be reminded of the good that can be done in this world by brave, humane, and compassionate people. And Dame Stephanie, to me, embodies this good, both in the early experiences she will describe for us of the generosity that she experienced from others, and in the life that she has chosen to live since. So it is my huge pleasure to welcome her and to introduce her for you, Dame Stephanie Shirley. Thank you for coming to speak this evening.
Except it isn't that easy. There are lists.
You have to be on a list?
Each one of us must get a sponsor. We'll pay a bond of £50.
What's £50?
The music that we've been hearing with one or two hiccups comes from Carl Davis's choral work, Last Train to Tomorrow. It was composed 10 years ago to commemorate the Kindertransport, that remarkable, largely improvised resource effort which brought thousands of Jewish children from Nazi Europe to Britain in 1938 and 39, on the very brink of World War II. I was one of those children, and today I want to tell you my story. Of course, hundreds of thousands of children never had the chance to make it to safety. They were left behind, and later, with their parents and grandparents, faced deportation and near certain death. The Nazis created a bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder worse than any the world had seen. 2 out of every 3 European Jews, and hundreds of thousands of Roma and Sinti people too. The Nazis called it the final solution. We call it the Holocaust, or Shoah, Hebrew for catastrophe. Today is Holocaust Memorial Day. My candle marks Britain's promise to remember the millions who suffered. Candles play a part in many different cultures. Their effect is soothing, and they act as symbols of light amid the darkness of life. There is a purpose in these ceremonies, in the act of remembering. One of the lessons of the Holocaust is that genocides don't just happen. They only occur when people stand by, afraid to speak out, or worse, when they are indifferent. By remembering the Holocaust, we keep the knowledge of it and the lessons that it can teach us alive in our minds and in our wider discourse. This year's theme of Holocaust Memorial Day is one day. My one day is the 6th of July, 1939, the day I was brought to my new home in Britain. A refugee asked recently what home meant to them, replied, "Home is where, when you go there, they have to let you in." Such a sad remark. Our world today is full of refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, fleeing war, civil unrest, poverty, or the effects of climate change. Holocaust Memorial Day offers a chance not just to remember those who died in the Nazi genocide, but to think about all those suffering today, the fear and anxiety that goes along with displacement, with being forced to abandon one home and, if you're lucky, to make a new home somewhere else. I was once a refugee, and shall speak today about my family's experiences as refugees. And our story may serve as a commentary on love and hate. The number of the dead is not the sole measure of the Jewish tragedy. I shall tell the personal stories of my secular Jewish father, Gentile mother, and my sister and I, offensively called crossbreeds, who all came to Britain as exiles in 1939 and survived. I am one of the few still alive to bear witness to that dreadful time. And you, therefore, are the very last generation to hear these stories firsthand. As the so-called Third Reich slips from human memory, I join in Britain's promise to remember. As my contribution to Britain's promise to remember the Holocaust, I shall tell of my secular Jewish father, and I'm repeating myself here, so I'm sorry. Let's move on. People who now live in security cannot begin to understand the horror of being uprooted, and our story may serve as a commentary on life today. We started off a respectable German family. The four of us lived in a nice house in a fashionable location, and my elder sister Renata went to school with the children of other prosperous bourgeois families. We never know what life holds for us. If all had gone according to plan, we would have remained in that comfortable world indefinitely. But the shadows had been gathering since shortly before my birth in 1933, and it was not a good time to be Jewish. My father, Arnold Buchthal, was a young judge, a brilliant but rather distant man with a single-minded devotion to principle that was slightly unworldly. I think he imagined that his incorruptibility would enable him to fight the evils of Nazism. But by the time I was born, doors were starting to be closed in his face because of his Jewish ethnicity. Again and again, we were forced to move from city to city and eventually from country to country in search of work and security. We eventually settled in Vienna, but the Nazi plague infected Austria as well. By my 5th birthday, a few weeks before the pogroms of November 1938, the writing was on the wall for anyone who dared to read it. Jewish families in Central Europe faced catastrophe. The once solid social framework in which our lives had been built had collapsed, leaving a choice between escape and eventual extinction. It was to be a descent into unimaginable barbarism. One of my clearest recollections of Vienna is of walking with my mother to fetch my sister from school. I particularly remember part of the route going along a huge stone wall. Many years later, I discovered two things about that memory. First, the wall wasn't huge at all. It was I who had been small. More importantly, there was a reason why we always went to collect her. It was because, even as a child, she was beginning to suffer from anti-Semitism. She was lucky to have a kind teacher who used to let her out early so that she could get home under our escort without having "dirty Jew" shouted or stones thrown at her by her fellow pupils. When my parents heard about the Kindertransport, they made the desperate decision that my sister and I should be sent to England into the arms of strangers in order to save our lives. The Kindertransport organized its trains from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the free city of Danzig. Each train had about 1,000 children aged 5 to 16, with just 2 adults. There were also some girls aged 16 plus, so not eligible to escape, caring for babies. Of course, I did not know at the time that they had volunteered to travel under a concession dependent on their return to what they must have known was almost certain death. Courage takes many forms, and I always salute the sheer heroism of those young carers. And recently learned of one of them. Let me introduce Lily Reichenfeld. who made 2 such journeys of loving kindness and honored the guarantee given by a non-Jewish friend. Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, and oblivion followed. Let me also thank the Christian and Jewish activists who set up the Kindertransport, the Quaker Society of Friends who kept it going when it ran out of money, and the many volunteers who administered that largest ever recorded migration of children. The first Kindertransport train was in December 1938. And as time ran out, people started to forge documents. No limit to the permitted number of children to be rescued was ever publicly announced. Britain capped its number at 10,000. Compare that with the number of refugees Britain talks about admitting today. While some children had to go into hostels, the refugee children's movement had found Renata and me foster parents in England who were prepared to guarantee, with getting on for £5,000 in today's currency, that the 2 of us would not be a burden on the state. Thank you, Guy and Ruby Smith. We call them Uncle and Auntie. They nurtured us as they would their own children, and certainly I am theirs in all but birth. Everyone told me to be grateful. Indeed, I am grateful, but also loved them dearly, cared for them in their old age, and honor their memories as I do all the uncles and aunties who helped us children through those terrible times. The fact that people I did not know saved us by doing what giving people do made a deep impression. Renata and I were doubly lucky. Both our parents survived, though sadly, I never bonded with them again. Moving now to Greta, my Austrian mother. She was the younger daughter of an established Gentile family who'd educated her to be a middle-class wife. Although my father wrote in 1940 that he feared my mother was lost, a euphemism used in front of children, she also managed her own desperate escape to England, bribing her way across Europe at one vital stage with the fur coat that she was wearing. What happened to her when she finally got to England, penniless, homeless, 4 days before war was declared? The regulations were such that she was only allowed to work in agriculture or domestic service. She chose the latter and cleaned somebody else's nice house before moving after some years to be a resident cook and then post-war to teach. Was my mother happy? I remember her inconsolable tears when one of her few items salvaged from the past got broken. Her will asked us to scatter her ashes in the Vienna woods, which says a lot about how she felt about her long exile. My main memory of that filial visit is of my sister's preoccupation with evaluating the likely roles of people we saw in the streets who would have been adults in the 1930s. What were you doing when they were throwing stones at me? Going back to my father, the Jewish one of the family, so necessarily the first to escape, by walking to Switzerland and thence by train and ferry to England. And he finished the war wearing a British Army uniform, which he'd acquired after a painful round-the-world journey. As an adult male German refugee, he'd been briefly interned before being deported in July 1940 from England to Australia. He went on the transport ship to Nera, guarded by soldiers on light duty because they suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. In any event, they ran amok, locked the internees below deck for most of the 58-day journey to Sydney, stole their valuables, and threw their suitcases overboard. The conditions on the grossly overcrowded, grossly overcrowded voyage were so appalling that, to Britain's everlasting credit, Parliament found time in the midst of the war to debate the scandal. And those deportees who survived the journey then travelled to an internment camp in Hay, New South Wales, so in the middle of an inhospitable nowhere that the high security fence was almost unnecessary. By May 1941, partly as a result of the outcry in Britain as families heard about the iniquity of their treatment, a substantial number of internees, including my father, were released to join the Pioneer Corps in the UK. The Pioneer Corps was a relatively new auxiliary force which provided backup work for the conventional armed forces. Hitler had taken nationality away from Jewish families, so we'd all arrived stateless, but received some modicum of paperwork from Britain, formally acknowledging that we were displaced persons registered in Britain. This was the so-called Nansen passport. I've always admired the polar explorer Nansen, who became such an effective diplomat and humanitarian. We progressed from being enemy aliens to, once people realized we were children, being friendly enemy aliens, and post-war, friendly aliens. And that shifting identity captures hate and happiness, villains and good guys. The fifth columnist or suspected terrorist, the refugee, the unwanted migrant or asylum seeker present a useful outlet for people's fears. After the war, my parents were free, in theory, to return to the homeland from which they'd been driven 6 years earlier. My father was desperate to rebuild his life in Germany. My mother saw it differently. Having escaped with her life and little else, it was unthinkable to her that her husband should do anything but build a new life from scratch in England, just as she had done. And the outcome was to modernize, predictable. They divorced, and my father returned to Germany more or less immediately. Shortly before the German surrender, he transferred into the American army, which needed educated German speakers to help with the post-war administration of what remained of the country. Germany had entirely broken down. The contrast to the orderly societies of Britain couldn't have been stronger or more nightmarish. There was no money, no gas, electricity, or clean water. The only semblance of civil structure was the crude military authority of the occupying Allies. People were living in the cellars of ruined buildings, bartering sex for food to survive, using cigarettes as currency. Black marketeer, white slaver. There was no warmth in anyone's faces. They were just blank from hunger and fear. I had lived through 6 years of the most devastating war in human history, but this was my first glimpse of its utter dehumanizing horror and destruction. My father was a junior researcher for the Nuremberg trials, in which former Nazi leaders were tried as war criminals. He worked on the role Eichmann had played at the infamous Wannsee Conference in 1942, which agreed the final solution to the Nazis' Jewish problem. And at one point, my father was called to give expert evidence on the precise linguistic nuances of the phrase Polish subhumanity and its use in German legal circles in the 1930s. Let me refocus on the shared Kindertransport experience of we two sisters. Me at age 5, clutching the hand of my 9-year-old sister. We slept on large strips of corrugated cardboard on the floor, as well as on the long wooden benches that lined the sides of the carriages. I believe that at some point in the train journey, children also slept in the overhead luggage racks. Presumably, I slept too, though cannot remember doing so. I guess that my mother had given us food for the journey, but again, I might be wrong. I do remember the occasional frightening interruptions from uniformed guards, nasty they were. I recall vividly the cold, oily smell of the sea, an entirely new experience for me, when we eventually reached the Channel, and I vaguely remember the nauseous night crossing to Harwich. But what about my sense that when we finally arrived by train at London's Liverpool Street Station, the platform was silent. Silent. It seemed somehow implausible, and perhaps I've merely projected the numbness of my emotions onto the past. Nonetheless, that is how my mind has preserved it. Hundreds of dirty, unwashed children spilling out onto the platform, speechless and wide-eyed, as if in a dream. We had numbered labels hanging around our necks as if we were lost property. In a sense, we were. Renata also had an expensive Lakha slung round her person, to be later sold, of course, because one was permitted to bring out a camera, but no money. We waited to be claimed, sitting on straw-filled mattresses in a cavernous hall. Britain was one of the very few countries who allowed us refugee children in 1938 and 9. What have we contributed in return? My sister Renata never settled as well as I did and remained an exile in spirit. When she was 18, the Home Office made several invitations to her to apply for British citizenship, until its final letter suggested that if she did not wish to become British, then, by implication, she should go back to where she came from. And that she certainly did not wish to do. She emigrated to Australia on a £10 assisted passage and applied for Australian citizenship after only 6 months. I've often thought about this. She didn't choose to come to Britain. The exile was done to us children. As an adult, she too had ceased to be a victim and could make things happen rather than having things happen to her. She chose Australia, and having requalified there, contributed significantly to its childcare practices, sublimating the trauma of her own childhood by helping children, including many of the Vietnamese boat children, into adoptive and foster families. She married an Australian, and they adopted a baby girl and fostered 2 brothers, just as we 2 sisters had been fostered a generation back. My mother and I remained here, though she would have scored high in any measure of nostalgia and never understood the British sense of humour. My only child died. As for me, born Jewish, saved from the Holocaust by the Quaker Society of Friends, educated by Catholic nuns, I attended confirmation classes with a view to formally joining the Church of England, but finished up as an agnostic, trying to lead a spiritual life. What do I mean by that? Unconditional love and compassionate action are requirements of spirituality. To focus on the essentials, love, friendship, animals, music, art, nature, all the non-material aspects of being. 3 things have driven my life, each the result of our exile in 1939. First, I learned to deal with change, indeed eventually to welcome it, and that's useful in the digital world in which I operate. Secondly, I determined early on to lead a life that was worthy of being saved, so I do not fritter my time away. And finally, my love for my adopted country is with a passion perhaps only someone who had lost their human rights can feel. As part of Britain's enduring promise to remember the Holocaust, we honour all victims of Nazi persecution and also the genocides in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Cambodia, Darfur, the list goes on. Let our words and deeds be of love for our neighbours, respecting and cherishing our differences. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a profoundly moving speech that covered so many different aspects, not just of history, but of what it means to be a human being in 21st century Britain and the world around us. There are so many important themes that you have touched upon and opened our eyes to. Yet the clock shows that we only have about a quarter of an hour left. I would say to the many people we have on our call, we have a short time to benefit from Dame Stephanie's experiences. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand so that myself or one of my colleagues can give the floor to you. While you formulate your thoughts and questions, I have so many that come to mind. Such was the depth and richness of your talk. One thing that I find myself curious about is, what are your thoughts, given the whole journey you have been through? What are your thoughts about the whole principles of reparations, with all the different connotations and contextual emotions associated with it? I'd love to listen to your thoughts about this, please.
Well, you bring up a very interesting point, and it's very germane to my life. everybody may not know that after the war, Germany made really very strong efforts to come to terms with its Nazi past. It's paid something like $90 billion in repatriation costs. And immediately post-war, I and many others applied for these fundings. I was very poor at the time, and I applied for it, only to realize that I didn't really want Germany's support. I'd rather be poor. And so I cancelled the process. My sister, who being older and wiser, had never even started the process of claiming reparation. Later on, though, having sworn a solemn swear that I would never set foot on German soil, my father returned to Germany, as I've said, and I had the choice really to continue a relationship with him, or I had to go to Germany in order to do that, because he certainly wasn't coming to England. And so I started going to Germany again, and slowly realized that it was up to people like me to hold out the hand of friendship, and that to start to bridge that ghastly gap between England and Germany and others. And that might have been the end of it. I did join the Anglo-German Society. I didn't do anything, I paid my subscription. But then recently, 2 years ago, I heard again from the German government saying that they were paying reparation to Kindertransport children, not for the lost education or lost family that they'd previously been addressing. And this time I thought about it more in a more adult way, and accepted, I hope gracefully, it as a gesture of reparation. And no longer being in need, I gave that money to a child refugee charity that I support consistently today. And they've given 3 small sums, 4,000, 2,000, 2,000, those sorts of sums, just to make up for mistakes of the past. Now, most of us are, I mean, it doesn't really make any difference, but the gesture is so important. It does make a difference. And I'm delighted that relationships have improved, and that I, as an individual, am able to accept their gestures of reparation.
Thank you very much. There is so much there about the generosity involved in receiving. And then, of course, what you did with that was very, very interesting. I cannot see any hands up nor any comments in the box. So until I do, I will continue to indulge myself, because there are so many interesting themes that you have raised. If we look at life today and the challenges we're facing as a national community of people of faith, of all faiths and none, in a predominantly secular environment, what are your thoughts about that theme you touched upon, joining hands across culture, across religion, across philosophy, not just as people who live in the same land today, but as people who may be accepted and others who may today be called aliens or thought of as aliens? What are your sentiments about this process of what joining hands means in 21st century Britain? And what lessons can we learn from the salient history that you have shared this evening?
I believe that reaching out joining hands is part of getting knowledge of other cultures. We're frightened of people whom we don't know, whom we don't understand, who are different to ourselves. But once we know them as individuals, all that fear goes, and true friendship and love can follow. I don't think it's relevant. I used to serve help in a homeless charity, and I washed up in the background while other people did the work. And then they sort of said, you know, come and serve the food. And I said, no, I can't. It's like a bear garden out there. It really can't. Of course you can, they sort of said. And once you start seeing this mass of aggressive, homeless people, hungry and angry with the world, but see them as individuals, then all my fear went. So I'm a great one for knowledge. I love to learn. I love to do new things, make new things happen. And so it seems to me that it's like a chain. I try to pass the good that was done to me, to pass it on. I can never repay my foster parents. I can never repay the people who made it happen, but people saved me, and I will try and help others.